Now, around 600 BC, Babylon came to power. So Babylon conquered Assyria. Babylon comes to power, and something happened. They came down to Judea and did something unique. They took Jeconiah. Now, Jeconiah was a king of Judea, and they took him away. But they didn't harm him because Jeconiah apparently, even though he may have rebelled slightly, but Jeconiah gave in to the Babylonians and said, listen, I'll give you some gold. Let's all get out of Judea. We're going to go to Babylon. So he was exiled. Jeconiah was exiled to Babylon. And you may remember that Jeconiah is mentioned in Megillat Esther, because in Megillat Esther they speak about the Babylonian captivity, but they speak specifically about the group of people who came from Judea to Babylon with Jeconiah, right? Because that was a special group of people, and that was one exile. That was one baby exile before the bigger exile that came about 15 years later. So Jeconiah surrenders to Babylon, goes to Babylonia, and not only that, the king of Babylon let Jeconiah live and gave food from his royal storehouses to Jeconiah. He treated Jeconiah as a noble, as a prince. And not only that, even the Jews of Babylon respected Jeconiah, maybe not publicly, but secretly. Jeconiah was respected as a king, the king of Judea, because the Jews didn't really buy the fact that Jeconiah was in exile. They said, you're among us and you're kind of our king, even though we can't really say it. About 15 years later, there was another king named Zedekiah. Zedekiah was not as fortunate. In about 586 BC, remember we were at 600 BC and now we're down to 586, Zedekiah pulled a bad move. He thought, well, he was paying taxes to Assyria or to Babylon, which was the big power, and he thought that he could decide not to, and then the king of Egypt would back him if Babylon got angry. So Zedekiah Zedekiah changed his allegiance, it seems, from Babylon to Egypt. And he thought that if Babylon will come down and besiege Jerusalem, Egypt is going to come to help him. Turns out Egypt never did come to help him. Now, at that time, do you remember Jeremiah? Jeremiah the prophet was one of those people, or a member of the groups in Jerusalem, who were really concerned. They were really afraid for the peace of Jerusalem and what the Babylonians can do. There were other groups in Jerusalem who wanted to fight the Babylonians, but Jeremiah was against it. He was thinking this is not a good idea. Babylon is much stronger than us. We should not fight them. But Zedekiah said we should fight them, and he did not surrender. Eventually, Zedekiah was taken into exile. His eyes were poked out. He had to watch his children die in front of him. And he was not as fortunate, obviously, as Jeconiah, who was exiled to Babylon about 15 years earlier. So, the Jews go to Babylon. It's 586. Around 540, about 30 years later, the next big empire, who's that? The Persians. Around 540, the Persians came to power, 540 BC, and the Persians, especially King Cyrus, allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. So the exile was over. Not everyone went back, but some people went back. And let's just say about 500 BC, people are going back to Jerusalem and they want to build Jerusalem. And we have a couple special people that come to mind during that time. One of them is Ezra. Remember Ezra? I'm sure you heard of Ezra, but not everyone knows that Ezra was a reformer. Ezra did a lot of things to build the Jewish people. Some people even compare Ezra to Moses. They compare Ezra to Moshe Rabbeinu because I believe he was the one who decided or enacted that the Torah should be read on Monday and Thursday. He did some things to strengthen the observance of Torah in Israel. He also told certain people or the leaders of the community in Jerusalem to divorce their wives who he felt were a bad influence, and he did a lot of things to strengthen Torah observance in Jerusalem, in Judea. That was Ezra. Ezra came back from Babylon around 460. 460 is when Ezra came back from Babylon. Now, about 20 years later, about 440, another man came back. 440 or 445, let's say 440. Sounds easier, right? Another man came back, and his name was Nehemiah. Remember Nehemiah? Nehemiah was actually, we're told, was the cupbearer for the king of Babylon. He was a royal minister. But he told the king of Babylon, I want to go to Judea. Why? Because he was told that the people of Judea were having a difficult time with the communities around them, and they needed a wall built that would strengthen the community and fortify the community. And Nehemiah came down, and I believe the king of Babylon gave him permission to build the wall, and I believe it took 52 days. And it was a difficult mission because there were the Samaritans or other groups around Judea were trying to stop Nehemiah from building the wall. And what they would do is all the builders carried swords with them. So they were not only builders, they were also warriors. And in 52 days, I believe, they built a wall around Jerusalem, or a wall or at least around the settlement of the time. That was Nehemiah. We're 600, 540, 460, 440. So we're at 440. Now, Alexander the Great, at around 330, Alexander the Great comes and he conquers everybody, right? Remember him? Conquers the Persians, conquers the Syrians, or conquers Syria, conquers Palestine, conquers Egypt, even down to India. So what happened was, we don't know much about Judea at the time, but what we do know is that we have one story that comes down to us. Remember Shimon HaTzadik? It was either Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous, or his grandson. I forget who, but one of them was the leader, I believe a priest at that time, and the leader of the Jews at that time. And the story is told that he went out to greet Alexander the Great. And the Samaritans, who were the enemies of the Jews at that time, also went out to greet Alexander the Great. And the Samaritans said that the Jews are not loyal to you, Alexander. And Shimon HaTzadik, even though he was greeting Alexander, but because officially it was the Persians who were still in charge of the area, Shimon refused to fight with Alexander. So he basically came to greet Alexander and tell him that I'm making peace with you, but I can't fight with you because the Persians are our masters now, and we can't rebel against the Persians. Nevertheless, as the story goes, Alexander says or told Shimon that it's Shimon's face that he sees when he goes out to battle, and therefore that is a good luck charm for him, and so he made peace with Shimon HaTzadik and the Jews who were living in Judea at the time. Of course, as you know, or may know, Alexander only lived about 10 or 12 years. He did not live long enough to rule his empire, and his whole empire by around 320 or 310 perhaps was divided amongst four of his rulers, four of his generals. Two of those generals were Seleucus and Ptolemy. Ptolemy took a big chunk of Egypt. Seleucus took Syria and Palestine, and for a time Palestine was in a tug of war. It was pulled back and forth between the Ptolemies, the Greek Ptolemies, and the Greek Seleucids. I believe that's what they're called. The Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt. So everybody wants Palestine. And in 167, a group of people called the Maccabees, or the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, 167 BC, they decide that the Greeks are infringing on the religious observance of the Jews, and we must rebel. So we must fight the Greeks. And the Greeks were getting weaker at the time, and so the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans were able to fight off the Greeks, and eventually the Hasmoneans, or the Hashmonaim, got some power and got their own little kingdom going. So for about, let's just say about 80 to 100 years, the Hashmonaim had power, and during some of that time they had an actual kingdom, an actual independent kingdom during some of that time. So now that's 167. Hashmonaim come to power, and they have power, let's just say roughly until about 80 BC or 100 BC. In 65 BC or 67 BC, that means 67 before 0, the Romans come into the area, they come to power. So you see, we've mentioned a couple different powers until now. We've mentioned the Assyrians, who gave problems to Achav in the north. The Assyrians gave problems to Chizkiah in the south. We spoke about the Babylonians, who eventually destroyed Judah, who eventually destroyed the temple. We spoke about the Persians, who came to power in 540. And now we are talking about the Greeks and then the Romans. So the Greeks came to power at around 330, and the Greeks ruled the area. And now the Romans in 67 BC come to power and start infringing on Judea. Now this became one of the most problematic times in history, because the Romans were not only infringing on the power, but they put into power a man named Herod. Now Herod came to power, I believe it's around 40 BC, 40 before 0, and Herod was a unique person because he was technically the son of an Idumean, a man from Edom. His father